You wake to silence. Not peace. Not stillness. But the kind of silence that feels sharpened, cutting through the air like the edge of a blade. Your breath escapes in short, visible bursts. Each exhale curls up like smoke and vanishes before you can see where it goes. You can't feel your fingers. You try to move them, but they answer slowly, like limbs forgotten by the soul. The air is heavy with the scent of damp stone, old sweat, singed wool, and the bitter tang of burning animal fat. Somewhere nearby, the last embers of a fire sigh in protest, clinging to the final scraps of warmth. The rest is cold, ancient, biting cold. The kind that doesn't just touch the skin. It seeps in. It settles in your teeth, your joints, your spine. The kind of cold that makes time feel slower, makes thought feel heavier. You sit up slowly, bones aching as if the night froze them into the shape of sleep. Your cloak clings to your shoulders. It's thick but stiff with frozen mud. The wool smells like rot and wet sheep. Beneath you, the floor is packed earth and straw, trampled into a frozen slab. Your feet touch it and recoil instantly. There is no relief, no comfort. Only the cruel indifference of another winter day. Outside, the wind howls like a wounded god. You can't see it, but you can feel it scraping against the thin wooden shutters, shaking loose the snow that piles at the edges. Somewhere in the distance, you hear a man coughing. Ragged, wet, the sound of lungs giving up. Another voice curses softly. Another starts a hymn but doesn't finish it. This isn't some forgotten village at the edge of the world. This is the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. And you are a soldier. Or a farmer. Or a slave. It doesn't matter. The frost doesn't care what your title is. The world tells itself stories about Rome, the opulence of its baths, the glow of its marble cities, the warmth of its hearths. But that is not the Rome you live in. That is not the Rome that conquered the snows of Germania, the highlands of Britannia, the alpine passes where even the sun is afraid to rise. Here, survival is not a matter of comfort. It is a war. A war against nature. A war that never ends. There is no modern heating. No oil lamps humming quietly behind glass. No central furnaces. No gas lines. No thermal underwear. There is only your breath, and your will, and what your hands can build before frostbite takes them. But somehow, Rome endured. Not just for years. For centuries. Through storms that buried entire valleys. Through ice that broke stone. Through winds that stripped men of their names and faces. So how did they do it? How did they survive the cold? The real answer is not found in architecture alone, or in some clever device tucked beneath a villa floor. It is found in what they were willing to endure, what they were willing to sacrifice, and how far they were willing to bend before they broke. Because warmth was not their inheritance. It was something they stole, clawed, and wrestled from the grip of nature, night after night. And when they couldn't find it, they became it. Their suffering became their shield. Their adaptation became their weapon. And winter became part of them. You're about to see how Rome survived the cold. But it won't be what you expect. It won't be warm. It won't be comfortable. And it certainly won't be glorious. It will be cold. Cruel. Human. And it will stay with you. You step outside, if you can call it that. The door is barely more than two planks held together by iron nails now rusted with age and ice. It groans against the wind as you push it open, a sound that belongs more to a dying animal than a structure built by men. The cold hits you like a wall, immediate, violent, and personal. It wraps around your face like a wet cloth dipped in snowmelt. Your breath crystallizes before it can warm the air. You are on the edge of the world. The empire calls this Britannia, but the locals know it by other names, darker ones, older ones, whispered by firelight in dead tongues. Behind you, a squat stone barracks crouches against the hillside, hunched like a beaten animal. In front of you, white stretches out endlessly. Rolling hills covered in snow, forests black with skeletal trees, skies the color of iron. It is not the edge of civilization. It is the edge of something older than that, something indifferent, watching. This is winter on the frontier. Hadrian's wall snakes across the land like a scar, thick, cold, unforgiving. Built to keep enemies out, but it traps its own soldiers in. Those stationed here are not the chosen elite of Rome. They are the expendable, the forgotten, the restless. Men pulled from the warmth of Africa, Hispania, and Gaul, now condemned to watch frost grow in their beards and hunger gnaw at their guts. Some of them will not survive this season. Most will never see home again. They sleep in rows, packed like firewood in narrow bunks. They burn animal dung when timber runs out. They eat dried peas and sour wine. Letters found here, scratched into thin wood or etched into wax tablets, reveal not tales of glory, but of desperation. One soldier writes to his brother, begging for warmer tunics. Another pleads for socks. Another, too proud to beg, just sends a list: shoes, cloaks, oil, anything. The cold is not just a temperature. It is a condition of the soul. It creeps into joints and minds, splitting both with equal cruelty. They barter with local tribes for furs, wolf, bear, even dog. What can't be bought is taken. Roman coin means little out here. Warmth is the currency. A good cloak can be traded for a woman. A handful of dry moss for insulation can save a man's life. The fires are kept alive not by fuel, but by discipline. One man wakes every hour to feed it. If he forgets, if he sleeps, everyone pays. And sometimes, they do sleep. And they don't wake. The bodies are frozen stiff by dawn, faces locked in expressions that never melt. There is no ceremony. Just burial pits hacked into the permafrost with dull blades and calloused hands. The frozen soil cracks like bone. You don't grieve long. You can't afford to. His cloak still has some warmth left. You take it. You have to. This is what it meant to be Roman at the edges. Not marble columns. Not oratory and law. Just survival, raw, undignified, necessary. And still, the empire demands reports, discipline, duty. You write on stone tablets with numb fingers. You drill in the snow until blood shows through your boots. You salute with a hand wrapped in cloth and blister. Yet the fire never quite reaches you. And if you're still watching this, from a warm chair, behind glass, lit by the soft blue of a screen, understand this: they didn't have your luxury. They didn't have the warmth you take for granted. They didn't have time to scroll or choose or skip. They had cold. They had hunger. And they had Rome whispering, "Do not fail." So if you've made it this far and haven't subscribed to Disturbing Tale, don't just sit there in comfort. Imagine a Roman soldier staring at you across centuries of frost. Prove you're not soft. Hit that button. Or go to the comments and explain yourself, explain why you've chosen inaction while they chose to endure. We'll be watching. From the wall. Now, listen to the wind again. Can you hear it? That isn't just the storm. That's history. Screaming. But not all Romans froze. Not all felt the sting of wind creeping through the cracks of crude timber or the slow suffocation of winter pressing down like stone. Beyond the frontier, back in the heart of the empire, warmth became a symbol, not just of comfort, but of dominance. A luxury carved into the foundations of the Roman elite. You step inside a villa. The cold ends at the threshold. The floor is warm. Not by firelight or accident, but by design. A subtle, engineered heat rises beneath your feet, seeping upward through polished tile and painted walls. You don't see the fire. You only feel its ghost, constant, quiet, obedient. This is the Hypocost. A hidden revolution in a world defined by frost and flame. A miracle of Roman engineering buried beneath stone and marble, where warmth flowed not from open hearths, but from hollow spaces. The architects of empire had found a way to turn the earth itself into a furnace. Beneath the floor, there are pillars, short, wide stacks of brick holding the structure aloft by a few feet. Above them, the stone tiles are laid like a sealed skin. Beneath, a fire is lit. Not wildly, not recklessly, but with control. The heat rises through these gaps. It travels through empty spaces in the walls. It moves like breath, alive yet invisible. Slaves feed it constantly, crawling through access tunnels, blackened with soot, sweating, choking, kneeling beside flames that never cease. Their backs blister. Their lungs rot. But the masters above dine in warmth. They bathe in hot air. Their children walk barefoot across floors that never chill. This is not just heating. It is hierarchy. You see it in the public bathhouses too. Steam rises in marble chambers. The walls sweat like skin. Wealth and rank determine where you sit. The farther from the furnace, the colder it becomes. And for most, it is always cold. Because the Hypocost was not made for the many. It was not for the garrisons on the wall or the shepherds in the hills. It was not for the peasant's crumbling hut or the widow's one-room shelter. It was for the senators. The landowners. The men who wrote history and the women whose names adorned mosaics. It was for those whose hands never blistered with labor and whose nights were never spent shivering against a dying fire. And even they feared the cold. In the provinces, adaptations emerged, regional innovations born of necessity. Thicker walls. Sun-facing atriums. Shutters sealed with clay. Heated stones placed under sleeping pallets. But these were workarounds, not salvation. The empire could engineer miracles, but it could not erase geography. Not every home had hypocausts. Not every family had slaves to tend to the fire. For every warm floor in Rome, there were 10 frostbitten children in the countryside. For every steamy bathhouse, there were 100 huts filled with smoke and silence. The miracle of the Hypocost did not lift the poor from the cold. It reminded them how far they were from the flame. And you, watching now, warm in ways they never imagined. How close are you to the fire? Because if this forgotten world of duct heat and buried flames has already shifted your view of Rome, if the quiet engineering of survival has stirred something in you, then do what they couldn't. Claim a seat at this fire. Subscribe to Disturbing Tale. Be counted among the curious, the cold-eyed few who choose to look beneath the surface. And if you won't, if the flame of history hasn't reached you yet, go to the comments and tell us why. Tell us what keeps you in the cold. Because here, we tend the embers of memory. And history is still warm. The body was never enough. It broke. It froze. It screamed when the winds dragged across skin like blades sharpened by the gods. The fire could die. The walls could crack. But the Romans, those who had no hypocaust, no slave-tended furnace, turned instead to their second skin, clothing. Not fashion. Not vanity. Survival. The tunic came first. A simple rectangle of wool, belted at the waist, sleeves if you were lucky. It held heat like a sieve holds water. So they layered it. 1, 2, sometimes 3, until their silhouettes swelled and stiffened under the weight. The wool scratched the skin. It stank when wet. It trapped fleas and sweat. But it saved lives. Over it, the paennula, a heavy cloak drawn tight like a shroud. Hooded, if fortune favored you. It was thick, often oiled with animal fat or beeswax to resist the rain. In the cold, it hardened like armor. Men slept wrapped in it, marched under it, were buried in it. It was less a garment than a shelter. Their feet, the most vulnerable, were wrapped in strips of cloth soaked in grease. Udons, makeshift socks, turned sandals into shields against frostbite. Some tied moss between the layers to soften the impact of frozen stone. The poor used straw. The desperate used rags peeled from the dead. But it wasn't enough. The empire was vast, but it didn't know winter like the tribes beyond its borders did. So it watched. And it stole. The fur-lined cloaks came from the north, Germanic tribes, Celtic clans, people the Romans called savage, yet whose ways they adopted when their own proved lacking. Fox, wolf, bear. These were not trophies. They were insulation. Roman soldiers draped themselves in barbarian warmth. It blurred the line between conqueror and conquered. The empire expanded. But so did its dependence on those it deemed lesser. In time, fur became a quiet necessity. Not just for function, but for morale. The cloak was no longer just protection, it was identity. A sign that the cold had been met, and answered. To keep the garments dry, they turned to oiling. Animal fat rubbed into the wool, smoke-infused and dark. It repelled water, but reeked. It clung to everything, the nose, the skin, the air itself. The dyed cloaks, deep reds, muddy blacks, stained browns, held warmth better than white. The brighter the color, the quicker it faded under frost. The elite, as always, had options. Imported silks layered over perfumed tunics, sandals lined with felt, cloaks dyed with rare pigments. But even they, wrapped in every luxury Rome could offer, could not escape the raw arithmetic of winter. Warmth wasn't comfort. It was strategy. Fabric wasn't decoration. It was armor. And still, many froze. The wardrobe was a war. Against the season. Against death. And most fought it with scraps. So now, look down at your own clothes. Synthetic fibers, machine-stitched, waterproof, breathable. Your jacket was made in a factory that spans more square footage than a Roman village. You don't worry about hypothermia in your hallway. You don't need to sleep wrapped in waxed wool that smells of livestock and fire smoke. You've adapted, effortlessly. They had to learn through suffering. Romans shaped their survival with what they could wear. You? All you need to do is press one red button. Subscribe to Disturbing Tale, and show us that comfort hasn't dulled your curiosity. Or if adaptation still escapes you, join the frozen skeptics in the comments. We'll be waiting. Cloaked. Silent. Watching. Discipline was the only fire they could count on. Wood ran out. Coals faded. Bodies gave in. But discipline, rigid, merciless, exact, was what kept a legion alive when the cold came hunting. Winter did not pause the empire. It tested it. And in the farthest reaches of Roman power, where snow buried the roads and frost made metal brittle, survival was not a matter of luck. It was a matter of method. Every movement was calculated. Guards did not stand alone in the cold for hours. They rotated. Every 30 minutes, sometimes less. A man stood watch while another crouched behind a windbreak, warming his hands over a brazier no bigger than a helmet. Then they switched, again and again, night after night. Not for fairness. For survival. A man left too long on the wall turned slow. Slow turned numb. Numb turned dead. The watch was silent. No chatter. No fires high enough to give away position. Just the sound of boots crunching frost and the wind clawing at cloaks like fingers trying to strip them bare. Those boots, caliky, weren't built for winter. Iron-soled, open at the top, designed for summer marches across dry roads. In the cold, they were a curse. So the soldiers adapted. They lined them with wool, wrapped their feet in udons, stuffed straw beneath their soles. Some carried spare rags in their belts to switch out when sweat froze against the skin. The bedroll was as important as the sword. It had to be dry, always. Men slept in shifts. They piled together like livestock, shoulders touching, breath mingling in the frozen air. One man at the edge always woke colder than the others. And sometimes, he didn't wake. Inside the barracks, everything served a function. Thick stone walls with narrow slits for air and light. Small hearths set deep into the floor to trap heat. Raised sleeping platforms to avoid the frozen ground. Nothing wasted. Nothing spared. They shared body heat. They rationed firewood. They learned to fall asleep quickly and wake up faster. The discipline of camp became the discipline of endurance. And the officers knew this. An army that grew soft in winter died before spring. So they trained. Drills in snow. Formations in sleet. Forced marches through ice and mud. Not for conquest, but to teach the men that even frost could be conquered. They built their own shelters when the campaign trail left them stranded. Leather tents coated in wax, trenches dug to redirect wind, fire pits hollowed low to avoid detection. Every soldier carried what he needed to survive the night: cloak, oilskin, ration, flint. Those who didn't prepare, didn't return. There were no medals for enduring the cold. No triumphs for outlasting a blizzard. But ask the veterans, the few who made it through 5, 10, 15 winters on the edge of the empire, ask them what forged their spirit, and they won't speak of battles. They'll speak of snow that buried the tents. Of boots stiff with frozen blood. Of men who died not from the blade, but from the wind. The cold taught them what Rome could not, that survival is not the work of glory, but of repetition, obedience, and pain. You, sitting warm, distant, untouched, do you understand that kind of resilience? Can you imagine fighting not just enemies, but the very season? The Romans didn't just train for war. They trained to resist nature. And yet you hesitate to subscribe. Romans risked frostbite to follow their orders. You're being asked to tap a cymbal. So go on. Adapt. Endure. Subscribe to Disturbing Tale, or explain your hesitance in the comments, if your hands aren't too warm to type. Because here, we remember the legions not for their swords, but for how they survived the cold. The body needs more than heat. It needs fuel. Not just warmth from without, but fire from within, steady, slow-burning, relentless. In winter, a Roman's most powerful weapon wasn't a gladius or a shield. It was a belly full of fat, broth, and blood-warmed wine. Every bite was strategy. Out on the frontier, diets shifted with the season. Bread hardened into stone. Olives froze solid. Wine thickened to sludge. So the soldiers and settlers turned to what the cold couldn't kill: grease, meat, and fire. High-fat cuts from pigs and goats were prized. Bone marrow boiled into broth. Lard was eaten straight, washed down with thick barley gruel or mulsum, wine spiced with honey and herbs, warmed over coals until the steam curled like incense in the chill air. There was no feast. No comfort. Only what could be boiled, burned, or chewed quickly before frost claimed the bowl. Every calorie was counted. Every ember watched. Firewood became currency. Cut too soon and it smoked. Burned too fast and it left you cold before dawn. Wet logs meant choking on smoke. Dry logs were precious, hidden, hoarded, locked in stone cells like treasure. Trees disappeared faster than enemies. Forests were felled not for war, but for warmth. They rationed by hour, not by need. 1 armful per night. 2. If someone was sick. 3. And the rest of the camp would go without by week's end. When there was no wood left, they turned to dung. Dried animal waste, shaped into bricks, stacked beside the fire like sacred offerings. It burned slow. It reeked. But it glowed. And that glow meant survival. Portable braziers, small iron bowls filled with coals, became lifelines. They carried them into tents, into stone huts, into the spaces where the wind couldn't go. They warmed hands, dried cloaks, brought feeling back into dead fingers. But the air didn't move. And that's when the real danger crept in. Charcoal gave off more than heat. It gave off poison. Invisible, odorless, slow. Men who slept too close didn't wake. They were found in the morning curled beside their brazier, eyes half open, mouths frozen in half-breathed sighs. Not frozen. Not starved. Suffocated. And still, they kept burning. Because death by heat was cleaner than death by cold. They learned how to shift the brazier at intervals. How to crack a hole in the wall for air. How to sleep in rotation so someone could always watch the flame. Not to stoke it, but to fear it. Fire was God and executioner. Every home, every outpost, every tent became a balancing act between combustion and caution. Burn enough to survive. But not so much that the fire turned on you. In the cities, where the wealthy lived behind stone and glass, they still feared what the poor endured, the empty hearth. The cold floor. The quiet death that came not with swords, but with silence. That fear shaped the rhythms of the empire. It filled the streets with smoke. It filled the granaries with pork. It filled the minds of commanders with nightmares of camps buried in snow, of soldiers starved from within and suffocated from below. All of it, every torch lit, every broth stirred, every stick of wood guarded like gold, was a ritual against winter. An ancient prayer whispered not in Latin, but in flame. And they kept whispering. Because silence meant death. They risked poisoning themselves just to stay warm. So tell me, what are you risking? You're not huddled beside a brazier. You're not rationing pork fat by candlelight. You're watching this with light, sound, safety. The least you can do is hit subscribe to Disturbing Tale. And if you're still not convinced, you know where the comments section is. Tell us your excuses. We'll be here, keeping the fire alive. But even fire was not enough. Heat could warm the skin. Fat could fuel the blood. Cloaks could shield the flesh. But the mind froze first. The cold stripped more than warmth. It stripped names. It stripped memory. It hollowed men out and left them numb behind the eyes. There were soldiers who forgot the sound of laughter. Women who forgot the shape of color. Children who stopped asking when spring would come. So the Romans did something most empires forget how to do. They clung to each other. They slept in circles. Limbs overlapping, backs pressed tight, breath shared like currency. One body meant heat. Two meant survival. Three or more, and you had a chance. Soldiers curled around each other without shame. Old men held the young. Brothers shared blankets soaked in sweat and frost. Pride was no match for wind that clawed through the ribs. They bathed together, not for vanity, but for life. In towns that could afford it, the thermi stayed open late. Massive stone complexes where hot air hissed through the walls like a sleeping beast. You entered with bones aching and left with skin raw, steam trailing behind you like a spirit. It was a ritual. Stripping down, plunging into warmth, scraping away filth with curved bronze blades. Laughter echoed here. Grief, too. Men confessed things in the steam they would never admit in sunlight. For a moment, the cold was held back. Not by fire. But by people. In the dead of winter, Saturnalia arrived. A festival of reversal. A week of sanctioned madness. Masters served slaves. Gambling was legal. Feasts erupted in homes where famine had crouched just days before. It wasn't joy, it was rebellion. Against the dark. Against despair. Against the yawning maw of silence that winter opened in every soul. They lit candles. They shouted in the streets. They wore masks, drank too much, danced until their legs gave out. Not because life was easy, but because it wasn't. Because when the snow pressed down and the night stretched longer than memory, sometimes all you could do was pretend that the gods were watching, and laughing with you. And they were watching. The hearth goddess, Vesta, was never far from Roman life. Her flame burned in every home that could afford one, and in the grand temples where virgins tended the sacred fire, day and night, season after season, without fail. That fire was not just holy. It was psychological architecture. A burning symbol that warmth would return. That order would resume. That winter, though cruel, was not eternal. Every Roman, even the poorest, was taught to respect the flame. To whisper prayers to the Laras, the household spirits, asking for protection from frostbite, from loneliness, from the long quiet that took men in their sleep. And it worked, not always in body, but in mind. These rituals, these shared hallucinations of warmth and return, were not delusion. They were survival. When your hands were cracked with ice and your neighbor's cough turned wet and red, belief was the only thing that could still burn. So they believed. In fire. In gods. In each other. And it carried them through. You may never have to sleep beside strangers for warmth. You may never have to wrap your fingers around someone else's in the dark just to feel alive. You won't be asked to strip down in a steaming room to remember what it means to be human. But they were. So before you move on, before you disappear back into your day, warm and alone, remember what they endured not alone, but together. And ask yourself, what still burns in you? What have you chosen to keep alive? If these tales of frost and flesh, of festivals in the face of despair, have stirred anything in your bones, then show it. Subscribe to Disturbing Tale. Join us by the fire, where the forgotten are remembered, and the past still breathes. And if you still hesitate, if you still feel the cold pulling at your resolve, go to the comments. Speak. Because silence was never how they survived. But for those who couldn't flee to the countryside or huddle in a garrison, for those who lived shoulder to shoulder in the belly of Rome or its outstretched limbs of urban stone, warmth had to be conjured from the very shape of the city. Design became survival. Streets were carved with sunlight in mind. Narrow alleyways twisted just enough to let light in without letting wind tear through. Builders positioned homes to drink the morning sun, south-facing when possible, angled like cupped hands toward the weak winter light. Not for beauty. For heat. A difference of a few degrees meant the difference between surviving another night and not. Walls thick enough to bury a man alive became insulation. Not hollow, not frail, but layered with packed clay, straw, and stone. The thermal mass of these walls absorbed heat during the day, what little there was, and released it, slowly, into rooms that had no other source of comfort. Vestibules were added to homes like skins around organs. Not entrances. Buffers. A space to catch the cold before it reached the heart of the dwelling. One door opened, the other stayed closed. Air trapped like breath in the body. Windows, when they existed, were small and placed with ritual care. South-facing. High. Narrow. Glass was rare and brittle, if present at all. Most windows were sealed with linen soaked in wax, animal hide stretched tight, or shutters fastened with cords. The goal was not to see, but to stay warm. Light was luxury. Warmth was law. For the poor, the endlessly poor, the ones born with ash under their fingernails and frost in their teeth, innovation became a kind of desperation. They warmed their rooms with cracked clay pots placed over embers, the interiors black with carbon and regret. They lined the floors with straw collected from stables, or swept the refuse of markets to plug the holes in their walls. When there were no cloaks, they sewed together the skins of rats, cats, dogs. Anything with fur and blood. Old sandals were burned when no firewood could be stolen. Tiles that had shattered in the earthquakes of Rome's endless tremble were repurposed, stacked, arranged, absorbing sun by day, bleeding it slowly through the coldest hours. They did not call it architecture. They called it living. Every stairwell became a windbreak. Every roof a trap for snow to weigh down and seal. Every corner was thought through with the kind of planning born only from fear. Not of enemies, but of the cold that crept in without name, without face. Even in the crowded insulae, apartment blocks built more for quantity than quality, residents learned how to survive by adapting the structures around them. Lower floors were warmer, stuffed with bodies and refuse and rot. The top floors, cheaper and closer to the gods, were death sentences in the winter. And still, people lived there. Still, they survived. Not because they were stronger, but because they understood something the modern world forgets: warmth is not given. It is taken, trapped, preserved, one decision at a time. So now, you, watching this in high definition, behind glass so fine you don't even see it anymore. You're wrapped in fleece, perhaps. Sitting on foam. The glow of a screen lights your room like an eternal hearth. The poor once found warmth in broken tiles and animal hides. You have heat at the touch of a button. You have light without smoke. You have comfort without cost. So if that's not enough to earn a simple gesture, one tap, one subscription to Disturbing Tale, then go. Comment. Share your 21st century struggle with commitment. Because if they could build warmth from rubble and prayer, you can spare a moment to honor what they endured. But there were winters that laughed at discipline. Winters that swallowed fires whole. That broke the backs of legions and turned cities silent. That pushed beyond strategy, beyond invention, beyond even the will to endure. Winters that did not test Rome, but defeated it. The skeletons tell the truth. Excavated from shallow graves and long-forgotten outposts, frozen toes blackened with frostbite. Joints twisted with the unmistakable contraction of hypothermia. Teeth shattered, not from violence, but from relentless chattering. Bones huddled unnaturally close, arms wrapped tight around ribs in a final, useless gesture of self-embrace. These weren't soldiers who died in battle. They died in beds, on stone floors, next to burned-out braziers and empty ration jars. No wounds. No glory. Just quiet collapse. The kind of death that comes without warning, when the body gives up the lie that it can fight the season any longer. Rome did not write songs about these men. But they existed. You see them in the sudden gaps in military records. In the letters that stop mid-sentence. In the payrolls that shrink not because of war, but because of wind. And sometimes, the survivors didn't stay. Entire units deserted during winter campaigns. Gone without a trace, into forests, into villages, into snowdrifts where their footprints vanished behind them. They weren't cowards. They were human. And even the strongest men bend when breath turns brittle and the gods turn their faces away. Commanders lied. Reported them lost in skirmishes. Blamed barbarian ambushes for what was really exposure, hunger, and the silent revolt of flesh against ice. Rome couldn't afford to admit that nature was the stronger enemy. Because once the illusion of control cracked, what remained? Abandoned outposts. Frozen bodies in latrines. Fields full of empty tents rattling in the wind. Rome had conquered men, kingdoms, entire continents. But it could not conquer winter. In the high passes of the Alps, entire columns vanished, mules frozen mid-step, wagons half buried in snow, the wheels snapped like brittle twigs. In Britannia, soldiers lit fires indoors, sealed the doors, and asphyxiated in the night just to feel warmth one more time. In Germania, they made pacts with local tribes for shelter, warmth, food, exchanging weapons for blankets, oaths for fire. It was desperation, dressed in diplomacy. Because when the cold dug deep enough, identity cracked. Roman. Barbarian. Soldier. Slave. It didn't matter. Hunger didn't care. Frost didn't pause to ask which side of the wall you served on. The empire stretched across 3 continents. But no road could outpace the season. So yes, they survived, many of them. But not all. Not the forgotten. Not the nameless. Not the ones whose final breath was taken in silence, far from home, under skies that never cleared. And now, you're still here. Still breathing. Still warm. Still watching. Not everyone made it. But you did. So either hit subscribe, or go down into the comments and explain why even frostbitten legionnaires would have had more backbone. Explain why a soldier, dying in the snow, clutching a broken sandal, showed more conviction than you holding a phone in comfort. We'll wait. The wind always does. You've seen the embers smolder beneath stone. You've felt the weight of wool pulled tight against a wind that never tires. You've walked the ice-cracked floors of forgotten barracks, watched breath curl in silence, listened to the 1,000 quiet ways a man can try not to die. And now, step back. Look at what they built, not just temples and roads, but systems of survival. The Hypocost, humming beneath marble like a buried heart. The Paenula, heavy on the back, soaked in oil and sweat, a second skin against the storm. Rations counted by firelight. Guards rotated before numbness became a coffin. Laughter forced through clenched teeth during Saturnalia. Hands held by strangers in the steam, just to remember warmth was possible. They did not just endure winter. They outthought it. Outfelt it. Outlasted it. Through invention. Through desperation. Through the oldest human trick, adapting faster than the cold could kill. Survival wasn't just about warmth. It was about grit. Community. Adaptation. And a discomfort most of us would never tolerate. Because they didn't have backup generators. They didn't have thermostats or fleece-lined slippers or coffee warming on a counter. They had each other. And they had the unrelenting will to see another sunrise, no matter how cold, no matter how gray. They wrapped themselves in whatever they could find. They burned what was once sacred. They bent their knees not only to gods, but to fire. To each other. To the bitter knowledge that staying alive was never guaranteed. You are warm now. Because they taught us how to be. And this is Disturbing Tale, where we bring the past back in all its rawness. Not to glorify it. Not to sanitize it. But to feel it. To remember the people whose names you'll never read in a textbook. Because they mattered. And because they mattered, so does memory. So if this story warmed your curiosity, subscribe. Stay by the fire with us. And if not, tell us why in the frozen wasteland of the comments section. Tell us why you stood at the edge of history and turned away. The past is still burning. Don't let it go dark.